You think you know the worst of humanity? You think the horrors you see in movies are fiction? Think again. Because what I'm about to reveal to you isn't from some twisted screenplay. It's from real government documents, sealed university files, and classified research papers that were hidden from the public for decades. When these records were finally unsealed, investigators, journalists, and even hardened scientists were left speechless. Not because of what they expected to find, but because the truth was so much worse than anyone imagined. Today, I'm taking you inside the most disturbing human trials in recorded history. Experiments so savage, so ethically bankrupt, that they had to be buried in classified vaults. Studies that revealed the terrifying depths of human cruelty when given scientific justification and institutional protection. But here's what really shook me when I discovered these documents. These weren't conducted by mad scientists in hidden laboratories. They were carried out by respected institutions, prestigious universities, and government agencies. People with degrees, reputations, and the full backing of the scientific establishment. What you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you view authority, scientific research, and perhaps most disturbingly, what ordinary people are capable of when they believe they're serving a greater purpose. Because the most horrifying revelation isn't what these experiments did to their victims, it's what they revealed about the experimenters, and potentially, about all of us. The classified files that changed everything. It started with a Freedom of Information Act request in 1977. A journalist was investigating rumors of government mind control experiments when he stumbled upon something that would expose decades of hidden atrocities. What he found wasn't just evidence of unethical research. It was proof of systematic human experimentation that violated every principle of medical ethics we thought were sacred. The first document that caught my attention was stamped Top Secret and dated 1953. It was a budget proposal for something called Project Artichoke, a CIA program designed to develop techniques for extracting information from unwilling subjects. But as I dug deeper into these unsealed files, I realized this was just the tip of an iceberg of institutionalized horror. What made these experiments particularly disturbing wasn't their scale, though some involved thousands of victims. It wasn't their duration, though some ran for decades. It was the methodical, scientific approach to human suffering. These weren't crimes of passion or wartime desperation. They were calculated, documented, peer-reviewed studies in how to break the human mind and body. The researchers kept meticulous records. They documented every scream, every breakdown, every moment when a human being shattered under their carefully designed torture. And they did it all with the clinical detachment of scientists studying lab rats. But here's what haunted me most as I read through these files. The experimenters genuinely believed they were doing important work. They saw themselves as pioneers, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. They published papers, attended conferences, and built careers on the systematic destruction of human beings. The first experiment that made me physically sick was conducted at a prestigious Canadian hospital between 1957 and 1964. Dr. Ewan Cameron, a respected psychiatrist and former president of the American Psychiatric Association, was attempting to de-pattern human personalities and rebuild them from scratch. His subjects were patients who had come to him seeking help for relatively minor psychological issues: anxiety, depression, postpartum psychosis. Instead of treatment, they received what Cameron called psychic driving. Patients were put into drug-induced comas for weeks or months, subjected to massive electroshock treatments up to 40 times the normal intensity, and forced to listen to recorded messages played through speakers in their pillows for 16 hours a day. The recordings were designed to break down their existing personalities. You are a bad mother. You are a failure. You have no worth. Played thousands of times while the patients lay helpless in their chemically induced unconsciousness. Linda McDonald was 25 when she entered Cameron's program for postpartum depression. When she emerged 6 months later, she had been reduced to the mental state of an infant. She couldn't speak, couldn't recognize her husband or children, couldn't remember her own name. She had to relearn everything. how to walk, how to use a toilet, how to eat with utensils. The most chilling part? Cameron's detailed notes show he considered this a success. He had successfully erased a human personality. The fact that he couldn't rebuild it as planned was simply a technical problem to be solved in future experiments. This wasn't an isolated case. Cameron treated over 300 patients this way, funded secretly by the CIA through front organizations. The families had no idea their loved ones were being used as test subjects in a mind control experiment. When the documents were finally unsealed, investigators found Cameron's own assessment of his work. "We have succeeded in producing a state of differential amnesia. Subject has lost most time-space orientation and shows considerable confusion. This technique shows promise for operational use." Operational use. They were developing these techniques not to heal people, but to use them as weapons. The children who became experiments. If you think what happened to adults was horrifying, what they did to children will haunt your nightmares. Because when these researchers needed test subjects with developing minds and no legal protections, they turned to the most vulnerable population of all: orphans, institutionalized children, and kids from poor families who couldn't fight back. The unsealed records revealed experiments that transformed innocent children into human laboratory animals. And the most disturbing part? Much of this research was conducted at institutions that parents trusted to care for their children. At the Fernald School in Massachusetts, researchers fed radioactive material to mentally disabled children for over a decade. The children were told they were joining a science club and were given special breakfasts with radioactive iron and calcium. The researchers wanted to study how radiation moved through the human body. The consent forms sent to parents mentioned a special diet, but never mentioned radiation. When families gave permission for their children to participate in what they thought was a nutrition study, they were actually signing them up to be human lab rats in atomic research. One victim, Fred Boyce, was 8 years old when he was recruited for the science club. He later testified, "They made it sound so exciting, like we were special. We got badges and certificates. We had no idea they were poisoning us." The radioactive doses some children received were hundreds of times higher than what's considered safe today. But perhaps the most systematic abuse of children was documented in a series of experiments conducted at the Willowbrook State School in New York. Between 1956 and 1970, researchers deliberately infected mentally disabled children with hepatitis to study the disease's progression. Dr. Saul Krugman, the lead researcher, justified this by claiming the children would likely get hepatitis anyway due to the poor conditions at the institution. So rather than improve the conditions, he decided to systematically infect them under controlled circumstances. The unsealed documents show the cold calculation behind these decisions. Internal memos discuss the advantages of using institutionalized children. Subjects are readily available in large numbers. They can be observed for extended periods. Parental consent is easily obtained due to economic circumstances. Parents were told that participation in the study would guarantee their child a place at the overcrowded facility. Desperate families, with nowhere else to turn, agreed to have their children deliberately infected with a dangerous disease just to ensure they received care. What makes this even more disturbing is that effective hepatitis vaccines already existed by the time these experiments were being conducted. The researchers weren't looking for cures. They were using vulnerable children to gather data they could have obtained through other means. The study continued for 14 years. Hundreds of children were infected. The research papers published from this work helped establish the careers of several prominent doctors who built their reputations on the systematic abuse of the most vulnerable children in society. When questioned years later about the ethics of these experiments, Dr. Krugman showed no remorse. "We were very careful to obtain proper consent," he said. "And the knowledge gained has helped thousands of children worldwide." But the unsealed records tell a different story. Internal documents show researchers knew they were violating medical ethics. One memo from 1963 reads, "Ethical considerations have been raised about this work. However, the scientific value justifies continued research." Scientific value. That's how they rationalized the systematic abuse of disabled children. The mind control programs that shattered reality. When people hear about government mind control experiments, they often think of conspiracy theories and science fiction. But the unsealed documents reveal something far more disturbing than any Hollywood thriller. A systematic, multi-decade effort by intelligence agencies to develop techniques for controlling human consciousness. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, which ran from 1953 to 1973, wasn't just one experiment. It was a vast network of sub-projects involving dozens of institutions and thousands of unwitting subjects. What makes these documents particularly chilling is their clinical detachment. Human beings weren't seen as people to be protected, but as material to be tested. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA chemist who ran MK-Ultra, kept detailed records of his work. In one memo, he writes, "We need to explore all possible techniques for influencing human behavior. No approach should be considered too extreme if it advances our understanding of the human mind." Too extreme. These words take on horrifying meaning when you read what they actually did. At Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, CIA-funded researchers developed what they called terminal experiments, procedures designed to completely destroy a person's existing personality so it could be replaced with a new one. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron pioneered techniques that combined massive drug doses, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation to reduce human beings to vegetative states. The unsealed files contain audio recordings of Cameron describing his work. The breakdown of the patient's personality is essential for successful reprogramming. We must first destroy the existing psychological structure before we can build a new one. One of his subjects, Velma Orlikow, was a Canadian MP's wife who entered the hospital for treatment of anxiety and depression. She emerged 9 months later, unable to recognize her family, remember her past, or perform basic functions. The records show Cameron administered electroshock treatments 102 times, some at intensities 40 times stronger than standard practice. In his notes, Cameron wrote, "Patient shows complete depatterning. Personality structure has been successfully dissolved. Subject now ready for implantation phase." But the implantation phase never worked. Cameron could destroy minds, but he couldn't rebuild them. What's even more disturbing is how widespread this research was. The unsealed documents reveal that MK-Ultra sub-projects were conducted at 86 institutions, including hospitals, universities, and prisons across the United States and Canada. Many of the researchers had no idea they were part of a CIA program. Funding came through front organizations with innocent-sounding names. At Lexington Narcotics Farm in Kentucky, Dr. Harris Isbell conducted LSD experiments on African-American inmates for over a decade. The subjects were given LSD for 77 consecutive days, doses that would be considered potentially lethal by today's standards. Isbell's notes, found in the unsealed files, show a disturbing fascination with pushing subjects past their breaking points. Subject 7 experienced complete psychological breakdown on day 23, he wrote, continuing with increased dosage to observe further degradation of cognitive function. These weren't medical patients receiving treatment. They were prisoners being systematically poisoned for research purposes. The records also reveal the CIA's search for a truth serum, a drug that would make subjects unable to lie during interrogation. They tested everything from LSD to barbiturates to experimental compounds that don't even have names, only chemical formulas. One particularly disturbing document, dated 1954, outlines plans for terminal interrogation, techniques designed to extract information from subjects who would not survive the process. The memo casually discusses the disposal problem, how to eliminate witnesses to illegal interrogation methods. But perhaps the most chilling revelation in the MK-Ultra files is how little the researchers accomplished despite decades of work and thousands of victims. An internal CIA assessment from 1973 concluded, no useful techniques have been developed. The program has been a costly failure. Thousands of people had their minds shattered, their lives destroyed, their basic humanity violated, all for research that the agency's own analysts admitted was worthless. The systematic torture disguised as science. The unsealed documents don't just reveal individual atrocities, they expose systematic programs designed to explore the limits of human endurance. What researchers called stress studies were actually methodical investigations into how much physical and psychological torture human beings could survive. At Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps conducted secret experiments on over 7,000 soldiers between 1955 and 1975. The soldiers were told they were testing protective equipment and uniforms, but they were actually being exposed to chemical weapons, psychoactive drugs, and experimental compounds designed to incapacitate enemy forces. The declassified reports describe experiments with a clinical precision that's almost more disturbing than the torture itself. One document details testing of Agent BZ, a hallucinogenic chemical weapon. Subjects exposed to varying concentrations of agent. Goal is to determine dosage levels that produce controllable incapacitation without permanent damage. But controllable incapacitation meant something very different to the subjects who lived through it. Soldier James Stanley was given LSD without his knowledge or consent, then monitored for psychological effects. His subsequent lawsuit revealed that Army researchers watched him suffer hallucinations, paranoia, and violent episodes for weeks without providing treatment or even telling him what was happening. The unsealed files contain Stanley's medical records from the experiment. Researchers noted, subject experiencing severe psychological distress. Hallucinations continue. Recommend continued observation to document long-term effects. They were documenting his breakdown like scientists studying a lab animal. What makes these experiments particularly horrifying is how they were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The Army developed techniques for breaking down soldiers' mental resistance that could later be used on prisoners of war or political dissidents. One classified manual, released through FOIA requests, details psychological interrogation methods. The subject's sense of reality must be systematically undermined. This can be achieved through sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and exposure to unpredictable stimuli. The goal is to create a state of learned helplessness. Dr. Albert Biderman, who developed these techniques, kept detailed records of their effectiveness. His notes describe experiments where subjects were kept in isolation for months, subjected to temperature extremes, and exposed to constant noise or complete silence. The goal wasn't to gather information. It was to study how quickly human beings would surrender their will to resist. At SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, training facilities, these techniques were supposedly used to prepare American soldiers for capture. But the unsealed documents reveal a darker purpose. Researchers were using the training as cover to study torture methods on their own personnel. One internal memo from 1962 states, SEER training provides excellent opportunity to study stress responses under controlled conditions. Recommend expanding program to include more extreme techniques for research purposes. The more extreme techniques included waterboarding, sexual humiliation, and psychological torment that left some trainees with permanent mental health issues. But rather than being seen as treatment failures, these casualties were documented as valuable data points. Dr. Martin Seligman, who later became famous for his work on learned helplessness, consulted on these programs. His research with dogs, where animals were repeatedly shocked until they stopped trying to escape even when escape was possible, was adapted for use on human subjects. The parallels are chilling. Just as Seligman's dogs learned to accept inescapable pain, human subjects in these experiments were systematically taught that resistance was futile. They learned to accept abuse because fighting back only led to worse treatment. What's most disturbing about these documents is how they reveal the institutionalization of torture within legitimate research institutions. Universities, hospitals, and government agencies developed sophisticated bureaucracies dedicated to the systematic abuse of human beings. Ethical review boards were bypassed or co-opted. Medical professionals violated their oaths to do no harm. Scientists abandoned the fundamental principle that human subjects must be protected, not exploited. And all of this was documented, filed, and preserved in official records, as if the systematic destruction of human beings was just another bureaucratic function. The cover-up that lasted decades. What happened when these experiments were exposed? You might expect outrage, prosecutions, and fundamental reforms to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Instead, what followed was one of the most comprehensive cover-ups in modern history. A coordinated effort to bury the evidence, discredit the victims, and ensure that those responsible never faced consequences. The unsealed documents reveal that by the late 1960s, government officials knew these programs were not just unethical, but potentially criminal. Yet instead of stopping them, they focused on controlling the narrative and protecting the institutions involved. A 1969 CIA memo, classified for over 30 years, outlines the agency's response strategy. Growing public awareness of research programs presents significant operational security concerns. Recommend immediate implementation of plausible denial protocols and preparation of limited hangout materials. Limited hangout is intelligence jargon for releasing some information to prevent discovery of worse truths. The strategy was to admit to minor ethical violations while concealing the full scope of the programs. When the Church Committee began investigating CIA activities in 1975, officials engaged in what can only be described as systematic evidence destruction. Richard Helms, the CIA director, ordered the destruction of all MK-Ultra files in 1973, just as congressional investigations were beginning. The only reason we know anything about these programs is that some documents were misfiled and escaped destruction. What we've learned represents perhaps 10% of what actually occurred. The other 90% was deliberately destroyed to prevent accountability. But the cover-up wasn't just about destroying documents. It involved discrediting victims, intimidating witnesses, and using legal technicalities to avoid prosecution. When survivors tried to seek justice through the courts, they found themselves facing teams of government lawyers with unlimited resources and classified evidence they couldn't access. Linda McDonald, the woman who was reduced to an infantile state by Cameron's experiments, spent 20 years trying to get recognition and compensation for what was done to her. Government lawyers argued that since she couldn't remember the experiments, she couldn't prove they had harmed her. They used her amnesia, which they had caused, as evidence that she hadn't been damaged. The few researchers who faced any consequences received minor sanctions that barely affected their careers. Dr. Cameron died wealthy and respected, with his work still cited in psychiatric literature. Dr. Gottlieb retired with full government benefits and spent his later years growing psychedelic mushrooms on his farm, apparently seeing no irony in his botanical interests. Most disturbing of all, many of the techniques developed in these illegal experiments were later incorporated into enhanced interrogation programs. The knowledge gained from systematically torturing innocent people was used to design new forms of abuse for future victims. A declassified FBI memo from 2002 references historical research on stress positions, temperature manipulation, and sensory deprivation, all techniques developed in the human experiments of the 1950s and 60s. The victim's suffering had become institutional knowledge, passed down through classified channels to new generations of interrogators. The documents also reveal how scientific institutions protected their reputations by rewriting history. Universities removed references to unethical research from their official histories. Medical journals refused to retract papers based on illegal experiments. Professional organizations avoided investigating their members' participation in human rights violations. When victims' families tried to access medical records, they found that crucial documents had been lost or were still classified decades after the experiments ended. Hospitals claimed they had no records of treatments that were documented in government files. Researchers who had published papers about their work suddenly claimed they couldn't remember the details. This institutional amnesia wasn't accidental. It was carefully orchestrated. A 1980 government memo discusses strategies for managing historical narrative around the human experimentation programs. It is essential that public discourse focus on individual aberrations rather than systematic institutional failures. Individual aberrations. That's how they wanted history to remember decades of systematic human rights violations conducted by respected institutions with government funding and approval. The cover-up was so successful that even today, many people still don't know these experiments happened. When they are discussed, they're often presented as historical curiosities rather than ongoing human rights violations that have never been fully addressed. Survivors are still fighting for recognition, compensation, and the release of classified documents about what was done to them. Many have died waiting for acknowledgement that their government systematically destroyed their lives in the name of national security. The truth that changes everything. After spending months reading through thousands of pages of unsealed documents, investigating survivor testimonies, and tracing the institutional connections that made these atrocities possible, I've reached a conclusion that fundamentally changed how I view authority, science, and human nature itself. These experiments weren't aberrations. They weren't the work of rogue scientists or isolated bad actors. They were the logical outcome of systems that prioritize results over human dignity, that value knowledge over moral constraints, and that allow institutional authority to override individual conscience. The most terrifying revelation in these documents isn't what happened to the victims. It's how easily ordinary people became perpetrators. Doctors who took oaths to heal instead chose to harm. Scientists who claimed to serve humanity instead served power. Administrators who were supposed to protect vulnerable populations instead delivered them to their tormentors. And they did all of this while maintaining the facade of respectability. They published papers, attended conferences, and received awards for work based on the systematic abuse of human beings. They convinced themselves that their pursuit of knowledge justified any means necessary. This isn't just history, it's a warning. Because the mindset that enabled these atrocities still exists in our institutions today. The same deference to authority that led people to administer electric shocks in Milgram's obedience experiments still operates in our bureaucracies, corporations, and governments. The same scientific detachment that allowed researchers to document human suffering without feeling compelled to stop it still exists in institutions that prioritize data over people. The same institutional self-protection that covered up these crimes for decades still operates whenever organizations are confronted with evidence of wrongdoing. When I read Cameron's notes describing his patient's psychological destruction with clinical precision, I'm not just seeing historical documents. I'm seeing a mindset that reduces human beings to data points. When I read about the bureaucratic language used to justify torture as enhanced interrogation or stress testing, I'm seeing how euphemisms are used to disguise atrocities. The victims of these experiments didn't just suffer physical and psychological trauma, they were erased from history. Their stories were classified, their suffering was denied, and their humanity was reduced to footnotes in research papers. Even today, many of their names remain redacted in government documents. But perhaps the most important lesson from these unsealed files is that none of this happened in secret. Hundreds of researchers, administrators, and officials knew about these programs. They had opportunities to speak out, to refuse participation, to protect victims. Yet the vast majority chose compliance over conscience. This reveals something profound about human nature that goes beyond the specific horrors documented in these files. It shows how easily moral reasoning can be overwhelmed by institutional pressure, professional ambition, and the psychological comfort of believing that authority figures must know what they're doing. The researchers who conducted these experiments weren't monsters. They were ordinary people operating within systems that normalized the dehumanization of vulnerable populations. They convinced themselves that their work served a greater good, that their victims were expendable for the advancement of knowledge. This is the most disturbing truth revealed by these documents. The capacity for systematic cruelty exists within all of our institutions, waiting for the right combination of authority, justification, and opportunity to emerge. The question isn't whether such experiments could happen again. It's whether they're happening right now, hidden behind classified stamps and institutional authority, waiting for some future journalist to file the FOIA request that will expose them to public scrutiny. Because the one thing these unsealed documents make absolutely clear is that when institutions are allowed to operate in secret, with minimal oversight and maximum authority, they will push the boundaries of human decency far beyond what any civilized society should tolerate. The victims of these experiments can't be brought back to life, can't have their suffering undone, can't reclaim the years stolen from them by researchers who saw them as expendable. But their stories can serve as a warning about the price of unchecked institutional power and the importance of never trusting authority figures who claim that human rights must be sacrificed for the greater good. The truth that stunned everyone when these records were unsealed isn't just what happened. It's how easily it was allowed to happen, how long it continued, and how thoroughly it was covered up by the very institutions we trust to protect us. That truth should haunt us. Because until we fully confront the capacity for systematic cruelty within our own institutions, we remain vulnerable to becoming either perpetrators or victims in the next generation of experiments that someone, somewhere, will justify as necessary for the advancement of human knowledge. The files have been unsealed. The truth has been revealed. The question now is what we do with that knowledge, and whether we have the courage to ensure that such systematic abuse of human beings never happens again. Because the most disturbing truth of all is this: the mindset that enabled these experiments hasn't disappeared. It's just waiting for the next opportunity to justify the unjustifiable in the name of science, security, or the greater good. And unless we remain vigilant, unless we question authority, unless we prioritize human dignity over institutional convenience, we may find ourselves reading about new atrocities in documents that won't be unsealed for another 50 years. The choice is ours. The victims of these experiments can't speak for themselves anymore. But their stories can serve as a voice for all future victims if we have the courage to listen and the wisdom to act on what we've learned.